He arrived barefoot, covered in dirt, clutching a battered old briefcase. The millionaire laughed in his face while executives watched and mocked. But when that briefcase was finally opened before the council, the laughter died instantly. The truth had been buried for nearly 3 decades, and now it was clawing its way back to the surface. The morning sun struck the mirrored windows of Whitmore Tower with almost violent intensity. 42 floors of steel and glass rose above downtown Chicago like a monument to ambition, each pane reflecting the power of one of the most influential families in the Midwest. At the very top, the executive boardroom sat waiting, its mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs worth more than most families earned in a year. Harold Whitmore stood before the bathroom mirror in his private suite, adjusting the silk tie that matched his charcoal vest. At 57 years old, he had cultivated an appearance designed to project absolute authority. Silver hair swept back with precision, an artificial tan, and a Swiss watch on his wrist that cost more than a luxury apartment. He smiled at his reflection with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had won at life. Today, the board would approve the international expansion of the Whitmore Group, another step towards cementing the empire he had built, or rather, the empire he had taken. But Harold pushed that thought away quickly. That story was buried nearly 3 decades deep. No one knew. No one would ever know. He descended via the private elevator, nodded to his secretary, and strode toward the conference room. His cell phone buzzed. Marcus, head of security. "Mr. Whitmore, we have a situation in the lobby." "What kind of situation?" "A child, sir. A street kid. Walked right through the front entrance and is demanding to speak with you. Says he came to collect something that belongs to him." Harold frowned. Homeless people occasionally showed up at the building's entrance, but security always handled them quickly. "And why exactly are you calling me about this?" "Remove him from the premises." "Sir, we tried, but the boy is causing a scene. People are filming with their phones. I thought you should know before this becomes a problem." Harold exhaled slowly, feeling irritation crawl up his neck. Of all days, when he had the most important meeting of the quarter, he ended the call without responding and marched toward the elevator. If this kid wanted attention, he would get it, just not the kind he was hoping for. The lobby of Whitmore Tower was a vast expanse of white marble, gilded columns, and a reception desk that resembled the counter of a 5-star hotel. When the elevator doors opened, Harold immediately spotted the source of the commotion. At the center of the lobby, surrounded by 3 security guards, stood a boy who could not have been older than 10. The child was blonde, but his hair was so matted with grime it looked the color of old straw. He wore a t-shirt that might have once been white, now stained and torn. His shorts hung loose on his thin waist, and his feet were bare, the soles blackened from city streets. But what seized Harold's attention was not the boy's wretched appearance. It was what he carried in his right hand. A brown leather briefcase, old and worn, with peeling edges and a rusted metal clasp. The kind of briefcase nobody had used in decades. For a single instant, something cold traveled down Harold's spine, a sense of recognition that made no sense. He shook his head and advanced toward the group, his Italian shoes echoing on the marble with authority. "What is going on here?" The security guard stepped aside, relieved to have someone take responsibility. The boy, however, showed no intimidation. When his eyes met Harold's, something strange happened. The child smiled, a small, knowing smile that did not fit the situation at all, as if he knew something that Harold did not. "It's you," the boy spoke, his voice thin but steady. "You're the one I came to find." Harold released a short laugh, utterly devoid of humor. "You came to find me," he laughed again. "And may I ask who you think you are, kid?" "My name is Tommy." The boy lifted the worn briefcase as though it were a trophy. "I came to collect what's mine." Harold's laughter transformed into a full, cruel guffaw that echoed through the marble lobby and made several passers-by stop to observe. 2 executives descending for an early lunch approached, curious about the scene. "Are you hearing this?" Harold turned to the men in suits, who smiled with equal condescension. "This street urchin came to collect what's his. In my building." One of the executives, a heavy-set man with a red tie, stepped forward. "Should I call the police, Mr. Whitmore? This is clearly trespassing." No. Let me handle this personally." Harold moved closer to Tommy, leaning down until their faces were almost level. The expensive cologne he wore created an obscene contrast with the smell of the streets that clung to the boy. "Listen carefully, kid. I don't know which hole you crawled out of, but you clearly walked into the wrong place. This company is worth more than you could earn in 1,000 lifetimes collecting bottles and cans. So take your ridiculous little briefcase and go back where you belong before I have you thrown into the back of a police car." The people around them laughed. Several employees watching from a distance whispered among themselves, pointing at the ragged child with expressions of mockery. A woman in a beige business suit shook her head in disapproval, as if the mere presence of this dirty child somehow stained the immaculate marble of the lobby. But Tommy did not retreat, did not cry, did not lower his eyes. Instead, he did something no one expected. He took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the millionaire even further, and held Harold's gaze with an intensity that seemed completely out of place in a child his age. "You can laugh all you want." The boy's voice was calm, almost serene. "You can call me whatever you want. You can have your guards throw me out on the street." Harold raised an eyebrow, amused by the child's audacity. "Oh, really? And why shouldn't I do exactly that?" "Because you still don't know what's inside this briefcase." The millionaire glanced at the battered case and released another laugh. "Let me guess. Crushed aluminum cans, old newspapers, or maybe you found some treasure in a dumpster." The executives around them laughed louder. One pulled out his phone and started recording. Tommy remained unmoved. His eyes stayed fixed on Harold, studying every reaction on the face of the man he had waited so long to confront. "Inside this briefcase is the truth, Mr. Whitmore." The boy spoke each word with weight that made something in the air shift. "The truth about this company. The truth about this family. The truth about you." For a fraction of a second, something passed through Harold's eyes. Something he tried to hide immediately, but that did not escape the boy's notice. Fear. "I have no idea what you're talking about, kid." Harold's voice had lost some confidence. "And I don't care." "Marcus." The head of security approached immediately. "Remove this child from the premises now and don't let him anywhere near this building ever again." Marcus signaled to the other guards, who moved toward Tommy. Two of them grabbed the boy by the arms and began dragging him toward the exit. The child did not resist, did not scream, did not struggle. He simply kept his eyes fixed on Harold as he was being taken away. And then, right at the moment when he crossed through the glass doors, Tommy spoke the words that made Harold Whitmore feel as though the floor had vanished beneath his feet. "Do you know what happened to Eleanor Whitmore?" Time seemed to freeze. The guards stopped mid-stride, confused by the sudden change in their employer's demeanor. Harold had gone completely white, absolutely white, as if every drop of blood had abandoned his face all at once. "What did you say?" The millionaire's voice emerged as a strangled whisper. "Eleanor Whitmore." Tommy repeated the name with perfect clarity. "The daughter of Richard Whitmore, the true heir to everything you see around you." The entire lobby seemed to have entered a state of suspension. The executives who had been laughing moments ago now watched the scene with confused expressions. Who was Eleanor? Why had that name transformed the most powerful man in the building into a pale statue? Harold finally managed to move. He took a step backward as though the boy were a physical threat. "I don't know what you're talking about." His voice trembled in a way he could not control. "I've never heard that name in my life." "You're lying." Tommy did not accuse. He simply stated it, with the tranquility of someone who knows the exact truth. "You know perfectly well who Eleanor was. You know what you did to her. You know why she never came back." "Shut up!" Harold's shout echoed through the lobby like a gunshot. Everyone around them flinched at the sudden explosion. The millionaire, who always maintained perfect composure, who never raised his voice in public, had his face contorted with a fury that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Or was it panic? "Get this kid out of here," Harold screamed at the guards. "Now! Throw him on the street and don't ever let him near this building again." The guards moved. Two of them grabbed Tommy by the arms and began dragging him toward the exit. The boy did not resist. He simply kept his eyes locked on Harold as he was carried away. And then, just as he crossed through the glass doors, Tommy spoke the final words the millionaire would hear that day. "Eleanor was my grandmother, Mr. Whitmore, and I have every letter she wrote to her father, the letters you made sure he never received." The doors closed. Tommy disappeared into the crowds of downtown Chicago, carrying his old briefcase and his secrets. And Harold Whitmore stood frozen in the middle of the marble lobby, surrounded by confused executives and whispering employees, feeling the world he had so carefully constructed develop a crack that threatened to swallow everything. The executive with the red tie approached cautiously. "Mr. Whitmore, are you all right? Who was that boy? What did he mean about letters?" "It was nothing." Harold cut him off, his voice still trembling. A lunatic, a disturbed child. Forget what happened here. But the looks around him said that no one would forget. Harold's reaction had been too intense, too disproportionate. A man who faced billionaire competitors without blinking had trembled before a barefoot child. Harold felt the stares burning into his back as he walked toward the elevator. The image of that boy's face would not leave his mind. The brown eyes that stared at him without fear, the battered briefcase he carried as though it were the most precious object in the world, and the name. That accursed name, Eleanor. Who was this child? How did he know about Eleanor? How did he know about the letters? Harold stumbled into the elevator, ignoring the executive's questions, ignoring the curious stares, ignoring everything around him. He stepped into the cabin and pressed the button for the top floor. When the doors closed, he leaned his forehead against the cold mirror and shut his eyes. Nearly 3 decades. Nearly 3 decades he had lived with that secret. Nearly 3 decades building an empire on lies. Nearly 3 decades waking up and choosing not to think about what he had done. And now, out of nowhere, a street child appeared with an old briefcase and spoke the name he had sworn never to pronounce again. Eleanor was my grandmother. The boy's phrase echoed in his head. If that were true, if Eleanor really had a grandchild, then everything Harold had fought for could crumble within days. The elevator reached the top floor. Harold crossed the corridor to his office and locked the door. He walked to the bar, poured 3 shots of whiskey and drank them all in one go. It did not help. His hands would not stop shaking. He sank into the leather armchair and sat staring at the wall, where a portrait of Richard Whitmore hung, the founder of the empire, the man who had welcomed Harold when he was nothing but a poor nephew, the man Harold had deceived until his very last breath. "What did you do, Harold?" The question came from nowhere. It came from within him, from the part of his conscience he had spent nearly 3 decades trying to silence, and for the first time since that era, Harold could not find an answer that would let him sleep in peace. The board meeting was cancelled. The executives received a terse message saying the president was indisposed. And as night fell over Chicago, Harold Whitmore remained seated in his office, alone with his demons. Because the ghosts of the past had finally found their way back, and they had come to collect every second of silence. Harold did not sleep that night, nor the next. The penthouse apartment that occupied the top floor of the most expensive building on Lakeshore Drive seemed to have shrunk. The walls closed in like a prison, and every shadow appeared to hide the face of that ragged boy who had appeared to shatter his peace. On the 3rd sleepless night, Harold rose at 3 in the morning and walked barefoot to the private study at the back of the apartment. It was a room he rarely used, filled with mahogany shelves and unread books. But it was not the books he was searching for. Behind one of the shelves, concealed by a false wall that only he knew existed, was an antique safe. Harold entered the combination with trembling fingers and heard the metallic click he had not heard in many years. Inside the safe, among documents and family jewelry, was a cardboard box yellowed by time. Harold removed it carefully as though handling a bomb. He sat in the leather armchair and lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was a photograph. A young woman in her early 20s smiled at the camera, chestnut hair falling in waves over her shoulders, light eyes shining with joy that seemed to illuminate the faded paper. A natural, genuine beauty that came from within. Eleanor. Harold felt his stomach clench looking at that face. Nearly 3 decades had not erased the memory. Nearly 3 decades had not silenced the guilt he carried like a stone around his neck. He closed his eyes and let the memories drag him back to the past, to the place where everything had begun. It was the summer of 1985 when Harold first arrived at the Whitmore mansion. He was 15, thin, awkward, carrying a cardboard suitcase with everything he owned. His mother, a distant cousin of Richard Whitmore, had just passed away. Harold was orphaned, alone, with nowhere to go. Richard Whitmore was 50 at the time, widowed for 5 years, owner of a construction company becoming one of the largest in the state. He sent for the boy and welcomed him as family. "Oh, you will have a roof, food, and an education," Richard said on that first day, placing his heavy hand on the frightened teenager's shoulder. "In return, I only ask that you be honest and hard-working. That is how the Whitmores live." Harold promised he would be, and for a few years he truly was. The mansion was a world completely different from anything he had known. Enormous rooms, uniformed servants, imported cars. But what impressed Harold most was Eleanor. Richard's daughter was 17 when Harold arrived. She was her father's pride, the sole heir to the empire, and she was the kindest person Harold had ever met. While other family members looked at the poor cousin with contempt, Eleanor treated him like a brother. She helped with his lessons, defended him when others mocked his accent. "Don't pay attention to them," Eleanor would say when Harold returned hurt from some dinner where he had been humiliated. "Rich people think money makes them better than others, but it doesn't. What makes us better is our heart." Harold never forgot those words. He also never forgot the moment when he began to hate them. It happened gradually. A poison that settled into his veins so slowly he did not notice. The longer he spent in the mansion, the more Harold wanted. He worked hard, studied every night, interned at the company from age 16. But deep down, Harold knew none of it would ever be his. Because Eleanor was the heir. Eleanor was the legitimate daughter. Eleanor would have everything, and he would be left with crumbs. This truth began to corrode him from the inside like rust-consuming iron. The years passed. Harold graduated in business, assumed an important position at the company, but it was never enough. And then, in the summer of 1995, something happened that changed everything. Eleanor fell in love. His name was James Morrison, a mechanic who worked in the company garage. He had hands stained with grease, an easy smile, and an honesty that shone in every word. Harold saw when they first met. Eleanor had gone to the garage to pick up her father's car. When James slid out from under a truck and his eyes met Eleanor's, Harold recognized it immediately. Love. That kind of love that happens once in a lifetime. Harold watched that romance grow in silence, feeling something terrible born in his chest. Not jealousy, opportunity, because he knew how Richard would react. The old man was traditional to his core. His daughter marrying a mechanic. Unthinkable. Harold began slowly. A comment here, an insinuation there. Nothing direct, nothing that could be traced. "Gee, Uncle, James seems really cheerful lately. Wonder if something happened. I saw Eleanor leaving the garage yesterday. She's suddenly interested in cars, isn't she? Have you noticed how James looks at your daughter? I think you should keep an eye on that." Richard was intelligent in business, but blind when it came to his daughter. So when Harold planted doubt, the old man did not want to believe. But the seeds kept growing. 6 months later, the truth exploded. Richard discovered that Eleanor and James had been together for almost a year and were planning to marry. The fight that followed was devastating. Screams echoed through the mansion that night. Eleanor cried, begging her father to understand. Richard roared with fury. And Harold watched from the shadows, feeling a sickening satisfaction. "Either you leave that man now or you are no longer my daughter." Richard's sentence cut through the air like a blade. Harold expected Eleanor to give in. It was what any sensible person would do. But Eleanor was not just anyone. "Then I am no longer your daughter." She said it with trembling voice, tears streaming down her face. That very night, Eleanor packed her bags and left with James. Richard did not go after her. His pride was too great. But Eleanor never returned. In the following months, Harold drew closer to Richard, became indispensable. "I will never abandon you, Uncle," Harold would say, holding the hand of the man who was withering from sadness. "You can trust me." And Richard trusted blindly in the nephew he had welcomed, never imagining that the frightened boy had become a serpent. 1 year after Eleanor's departure, Richard made a new will. Harold was present when the old man signed papers transferring everything to his nephew, but what Harold never told anyone was what happened to the letters, because Eleanor wrote. She wrote often. The first letter arrived 3 months after her departure. Harold intercepted it before it reached Richard. He read every word, every plea for forgiveness. "Father, I know you are angry, but James is a good man. If you really knew us, you would understand. We got married last month. I wish you had been there." Harold kept the letter in a drawer. He did not destroy it, but did not let it reach its destination. The letters kept coming. 1 a month, sometimes 2. 47 letters over the years. Eleanor never gave up, and Harold intercepted everyone. What he did not know was that someone in the mansion had noticed. Ruth Macmillan, the oldest servant in the house, saw Harold hiding one of the letters. She said nothing then, but from that day, she began to watch. When she could, she took letters before Harold and made copies. Ruth had known Eleanor since she was a baby, loved that girl as her own. She would not let her story be erased. Richard died 5 years after Eleanor left. He died believing his daughter had abandoned him. died with a broken heart, never knowing she had tried to come back, and Harold inherited everything: the construction company, the properties, the bank accounts, the Whitmore name, everything he had always wanted. The price was merely a destroyed life, a shattered family, a buried truth. Now sitting in his study at 3 in the morning, holding Eleanor's photograph, he understood what had happened. Eleanor had a child, a daughter who had a son, a blonde boy with brown eyes who had appeared from nowhere with an old briefcase. Tommy, the great-grandson Richard never met, the heir who should have received everything. But how did that boy know everything? How had he obtained proof? Harold knew Eleanor had died years ago from an illness. James had died even before that, in a workplace accident when their daughter was still young. So who told the truth to that child? Harold looked at Eleanor's photograph. Her smile seemed different now. It seemed to say, "You thought you had won, but the truth always finds a way." He threw the photo back in the box and closed the lid. He needed to find out about that boy, where he lived, who he lived with, what he possessed. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of Peterson, his private investigator. "Peterson, I need you to find someone, a street kid, about 10, blonde, carries an old briefcase. I want to know everything, where he sleeps, who he knows, what he has." "Understood, Mr. Whitmore." "Time frame?" "Yesterday, and Peterson, this is confidential, no one can know." 2 days later, Peterson called with news that made Harold's blood run cold. "Found the kid, Mr. Whitmore. Lives in a trailer park on the south side, being raised by an elderly woman." Harold felt ice spread through his chest. "What's her name?" "Ruth. Ruth Macmillan. Worked for your family nearly 3 decades. You dismissed her right after taking control." The silence that followed was so dense that Peterson had to ask if the call had dropped. "Mr. Whitmore? You there?" "I'm here." Harold's voice came out strangled. "Send me the address." Ruth Macmillan, the servant he had thrown out when Richard died. The woman who knew every secret. The only living person who witnessed everything. How could he have been so foolish? How had he not realized she was a threat? Harold cancelled every meeting that day. He climbed into the armored car and ordered the driver to head for the south side. As the vehicle advanced, glass and steel buildings gave way to crowded houses and potholed streets. The contrast was brutal. Harold lived in a world of marble and champagne. Now he was entering a universe of exposed brick and broken sidewalks. The driver stopped at a trailer at the end of a narrow lot. The walls were dented metal patched with blue plastic tarp. A skinny dog slept by the door, and clotheslines displayed worn clothes drying in the sun. This was where Richard Whitmore's great-great-grandson lived. The legitimate heir to a billion-dollar empire lived in a shack not worth the price of Harold's shoes. For an instant, something resembling shame crossed Harold's chest, but he suffocated the feeling. He had not come to feel pity. He had come to solve a problem. He stepped out of the car and walked to the trailer door. His knuckles struck the metal 3 times. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door swung open, and there she stood. Ruth Macmillan had aged considerably since Harold last saw her. Her hair, once black and always in a perfect bun, was now completely white and thin. Deep wrinkles marked her face, telling stories of decades of hard work. Her hands trembled slightly, marked by dark spots of time. But her eyes were exactly the same. Black, piercing, filled with a strength that age had not managed to extinguish. Ruth looked at Harold without showing any surprise, as if she had been expecting this visit for a very long time. "I wondered how long it would take you to find this place." Her voice was hoarse but firm. 27 years I've been waiting. I knew someday you'd come knocking." Harold opened his mouth to speak, but Ruth raised her hand. "Before you say a single word, Harold Whitmore, you should know something." She stepped aside, revealing the dim interior of the trailer. On a small table near the window sat a worn cardboard box. "I have copies of every letter Eleanor ever wrote. 47 letters. I have the original will that Richard signed before you poisoned his mind. I have photographs, documents, testimony from 3 other servants who saw what you did." Harold felt his legs weaken. Ruth leaned closer, her eyes burning into his. "I have been building this case for 27 years. Every piece of evidence, every proof of your lies, all waiting for the right moment." She paused, a hint of satisfaction crossing her weathered face. "And now that moment has come. Because Tommy is ready, and so am I." She stepped back and gestured toward the inside of the trailer. "So come in, Harold. Let me show you exactly how your empire is about to fall." Harold stood frozen at the threshold of the trailer, staring at the woman who had just dismantled 27 years of carefully constructed lies with a single sentence. Ruth Macmillan did not move. She simply waited, her weathered hand still holding the door open, her dark eyes fixed on the man she had watched transform from a frightened orphan into a monster of greed. "Are you coming in, or are you going to stand there until your driver gets suspicious?" Her voice carried no fear, only the quiet confidence of someone holding all the cards. Harold's legs felt like they belonged to someone else as he stepped inside. The entire space was smaller than his bathroom. A tiny kitchen occupied one corner. 2 narrow beds lined the opposite wall, and a small table with mismatched chairs sat beneath a window. But what made Harold's breath catch was the wall above one of the beds. Photographs, dozens of them. Eleanor as a baby in Ruth's arms. Eleanor as a teenager, her smile bright enough to light up the faded paper. Eleanor as a young woman visibly pregnant. Eleanor older, thinner, holding a baby girl with chestnut hair. And more recent photos. A young woman who looked exactly like Eleanor. Tommy as an infant. Tommy taking his first steps. Tommy on his first day of school. Harold's eyes stopped on one photograph. Eleanor, gaunt and pale, lying in a hospital bed. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks hollow, but she was smiling. In her arms she held a toddler with blonde hair. Tommy. That was taken 3 weeks before she passed. Ruth's voice came from behind him. She knew she was dying, but she wanted to hold him one more time. Harold could not speak, could not move, could barely breathe. "Sit down." Ruth pointed to one of the chairs. "We have much to discuss." Harold obeyed, lowering himself onto the chair that creaked under his weight. Ruth sat across from him. "Before you think about how to buy my silence, let me save you the trouble." Ruth folded her hands on the table. "I am 78 years old. I have a heart condition that gives me maybe a year. I have nothing left to lose." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I have spent 27 years preparing for this moment. Every night I would organize the evidence, copy documents, write down everything I remembered. A lawyer has been holding sealed copies for 15 years, with instructions to release them if anything happens to me or Tommy." Harold's mouth went dry. "So whatever you're planning," Ruth continued, "forget it. The only path forward is the one I'm about to offer you." "What do you want?" Harold's voice came out as a croak. Ruth reached for the cardboard box on the table and removed the lid. Inside, Harold could see stacks of yellowed papers, photographs, and documents organized with meticulous care. "I want you to understand what you destroyed." Ruth pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These are copies of the 47 letters Eleanor wrote to her father. Every single one. I copied them by hand, word for word, in the middle of the night while you slept in your stolen bed." She untied the ribbon and spread some of the letters on the table. "This one was written 3 months after she left. She begged Richard to forgive her, told him about her wedding to James, asked if she could come home even just for a visit." Ruth pulled out another letter. "This one came a year later. She was pregnant. She wanted her father to know he was going to be a grandfather. She named her daughter Margaret, after Richard's mother. She hoped that might soften his heart." Another letter. "This one was written when Margaret was 5 years old. Eleanor was working 2 jobs to pay the bills because James had been injured at work and couldn't provide for the family. She didn't ask for money. She just wanted her father to meet his granddaughter." Harold felt something crack inside his chest. A wall he had built brick by brick over nearly 3 decades. "James died when Margaret was 12. Ruth's voice hardened. "A truck fell off the jack while he was working underneath it. Eleanor had to tell her daughter that her father wasn't coming home. Had to watch that little girl cry herself to sleep for months." She pulled out more letters. "After James died, Eleanor wrote to Richard almost every week. She was desperate, alone, raising a child with nothing. But every letter came back unopened. Because you made sure Richard never saw them. Because you intercepted every single one." "I didn't know she was suffering." Harold whispered the lie even he didn't believe. "You knew." Ruth's voice was ice. "You knew because I told you." Harold looked up sharply. "You don't remember?" Ruth's smile was bitter. 6 months after Eleanor left, I came to you. I begged you to let just one letter through. I told you Eleanor was struggling, that she and James were living in a tiny apartment, barely making ends meet. Do you remember what you said?" Harold shook his head, though the memory was surfacing like a corpse from deep water. "You said, 'She made her choice, let her live with it.' And then you threatened to fire me if I ever mentioned her name again." The silence that followed was suffocating. Eleanor got sick when Margaret was 23. Ruth continued, her voice cracking for the first time. The same illness that took her mother. By the time they caught it, it had already spread too far. She had maybe 2 years, the doctors said. Ruth reached into the box and pulled out another photograph. Eleanor in a hospital gown, skeletal and pale, but still smiling, still trying to be strong. Margaret had just had Tommy when Eleanor was diagnosed. My sweet girl spent the last 2 years of her life watching her daughter raise a baby while dealing with her own death. She never complained, never showed bitterness. She just wanted to hold her grandson as long as she could. A tear escaped down Ruth's weathered cheek. Eleanor died when Tommy was 2 years old. Margaret was devastated. She tried to keep going for her son, but the grief consumed her. She started drinking, lost her job, lost her apartment. Ruth's voice broke completely. Margaret died in a car accident when Tommy was 7. She had been drinking, lost control on a rainy night. They say she died on impact. Small mercy, I suppose. Harold sat frozen, the weight of what he was hearing crushing him from the inside. So I took Tommy. Ruth wiped her face with a trembling hand. I was 71 years old, living on Social Security, and I took in a 7-year-old boy who had just lost everything. Because someone had to, because Eleanor would have wanted me to, because that child deserved better than the fate your greed had created. She reached across the table and gripped Harold's wrist with surprising strength. Do you understand now? Do you see what your lies cost? Eleanor died thinking her father hated her. Richard died thinking his daughter had abandoned him. James died working himself to exhaustion, trying to provide for a family that should have had everything. Margaret grew up without grandparents, without security, without hope. And Tommy spent his first 7 years watching everyone he loved disappear. Harold could not meet her eyes, could not face the devastation he had caused. But Eleanor left something behind. Ruth released his wrist and reached into the box one final time. She pulled out a thick manila envelope, worn at the edges. Before she died, she gave me this, told me to keep it safe until Tommy was old enough to understand, until he was ready to fight for what was rightfully his. She placed the envelope on the table between them. Inside this envelope is the original will that Richard Whitmore signed before you poisoned his mind. The real will. The one that leaves everything to Eleanor and her descendants. I was a witness when he signed it, along with Dr. William Foster, the family lawyer. It's notarized, dated, and completely legal. Harold stared at the envelope as though it contained a bomb. There's also a letter from Dr. Foster, confirming that the will you presented after Richard's death was forged. He suspected it at the time, but was afraid to speak up. He gave me his written testimony 2 years ago, along with a full confession. He's 91 now, but his mind is sharp, and he's prepared to testify if needed. Ruth leaned back in her chair, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. So here is what's going to happen, Harold. Next week there's a board meeting scheduled for the Whitmore Group. You are going to call an emergency session. You are going to stand before that board and tell them the truth, all of it, every lie, every scheme, every letter you stole. They'll destroy me. Harold's voice was barely audible. Yes, Ruth nodded. They probably will. But here's the alternative. If you don't confess, I will release everything to the press. Every letter, every document, every piece of evidence. Your reputation won't just be destroyed, Harold. It will be annihilated. You'll spend whatever years you have left fighting lawsuits and criminal charges, and you'll lose, because the truth always wins in the end. The trailer door opened. Tommy walked in carrying a plastic bag of groceries, his bare feet dirty from the walk. He stopped when he saw Harold sitting at the table, his young face hardening with recognition. Grandma Ruth. The boy's voice was steady, but wary. What is he doing here? Ruth stood slowly and walked to Tommy, placing her hands on his shoulders. He came to hear the truth, sweetheart, and to make a choice. Tommy looked at Harold with those brown eyes that carried far too much wisdom for a 10-year-old. My mom used to tell me stories about my great-grandmother Eleanor. The boy spoke directly to Harold, his voice clear. She said Eleanor was the kindest person who ever lived, that she never stopped loving her father, even when he wouldn't write back, that she forgave him before she died. Tommy set down the groceries and walked to stand beside Ruth. My mom also told me about you, about what you did. She wasn't angry, though. She just felt sorry for you. She said you must be very sad inside to do something so cruel. Harold felt tears he hadn't shed in decades burning behind his eyes. I used to be angry, Tommy admitted. When I was little, I used to wish bad things would happen to you. But Grandma Ruth taught me something. She taught me that holding on to hate is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick." The boy took a step closer to Harold. "So I'm not here to destroy you, Mr. Whitmore. I'm here to give you a chance to tell the truth, a chance to make things right, a chance to stop carrying all those lies before they bury you alive." Harold looked at this child, this barefoot boy from a trailer park who should have inherited billions, and saw something he had not seen in nearly 3 decades. Grace. "The board meets on Tuesday," Ruth spoke firmly. "You have until then to decide what kind of man you want to be remembered as, the one who stole everything and lied to the grave, or the one who finally found the courage to tell the truth." Harold rose from the chair on unsteady legs. He looked at the photographs on the wall, at the box full of evidence, at the old woman who had dedicated her final years to justice, at the boy who had every reason to hate him but offered mercy instead. "Tuesday," he heard himself say. "I'll be there." He walked to the door, paused, and turned back one final time. "I'm sorry." The words felt foreign on his tongue. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry." Ruth nodded slowly. "Save the apology for the board, Harold, and for Richard, wherever he is. He's the one who deserved to hear it most." Harold stepped out into the fading afternoon light, leaving behind the tiny trailer that held the power to destroy everything he had built. As his car pulled away, Tommy watched from the window, the worn briefcase clutched against his chest. "Do you think he'll really do it, Grandma Ruth?" The old woman placed her hand on the boy's shoulder and sighed. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I do know this. The truth has waited nearly 30 years to be heard, and one way or another, it will speak." The boardroom of Whitmore Tower had never felt so suffocating. Tuesday morning arrived with a grey sky that seemed to press down on the city like a weight. Harold Whitmore sat at the head of the mahogany table, his hands folded in front of him, his face a mask of exhaustion. He had not slept since leaving Ruth's trailer, had not eaten, had barely moved from his study staring at the portrait of Richard Whitmore until the old man's painted eyes seemed to bore into his soul. The 10 members of the board filed in one by one, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Harold had called this emergency meeting with no explanation, no agenda, no documents distributed in advance. In nearly 3 decades of running the company, he had never done anything like this. Victoria Thornton, the oldest member of the board at 72, took her seat to Harold's right. She had known Richard Whitmore personally, had been one of his closest business partners before his death. Her sharp eyes studied Harold with growing unease. "Harold, you look terrible." Her voice was blunt, as always. "What's going on? Why the emergency session?" Harold did not answer. His eyes were fixed on the door. The other board members exchanged glances. David Chen, the youngest member at 45, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something. Robert Hayes, the company's chief financial officer, checked his watch impatiently. "Harold," Victoria's voice hardened, "we've all cleared our schedules for this. The least you can do is tell us why we're here." Before Harold could respond, the boardroom door swung open, and the room fell absolutely silent. Ruth Macmillan entered first, walking slowly but with her head held high. She wore the same simple floral dress she had worn at the trailer, her white hair combed neatly, her dark eyes scanning the room with quiet determination. In her hands, she carried a worn cardboard box. Behind her came Tommy. The boy had been cleaned up for the occasion. His blonde hair was combed, his face scrubbed. He wore khaki pants and a blue polo shirt that looked new but inexpensive. On his feet were clean sneakers, and in his hands he carried the old leather briefcase that had started everything. The board members stared in bewilderment. Several recognized Tommy from the incident in the lobby the week before. Others had only heard rumors about the strange confrontation that had left Harold Whitmore visibly shaken. "What is this?" Robert Hayes demanded, half rising from his chair. "Harold, who are these people? Why is that street kid in our boardroom?" Harold raised his hand slowly, a gesture that silenced the room. "Sit down, Robert." His voice sounded hollow, defeated. "They're here because I invited them, because it's time you all heard the truth." The confusion in the room was palpable. Victoria Thornton leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "What truth? Harold, you're not making any sense." A new figure appeared in the doorway. Dr. William Foster, 91 years old, walked in with the help of a cane. His hair was completely white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He had been Richard Whitmore's personal attorney for over 4 decades, and several board members recognized him immediately. "William," Victoria's voice carried genuine shock. "I thought you had retired years ago. What are you doing here?" Dr. Foster made his way to an empty chair and lowered himself into it with a heavy sigh. "I'm here to correct a mistake I made nearly 3 decades ago, Victoria." His voice was thin but steady. "A mistake that has haunted me every day since. A mistake that destroyed a family and built an empire on lies." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Harold closed his eyes, feeling the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on his chest. "Please," Ruth's voice cut through the noise, "let me explain." She walked to the head of the table and set the cardboard box down beside Harold. Then she turned to face the board members, her weathered hands clasped in front of her. "My name is Ruth Macmillan. I worked in the Whitmore household for 34 years. I was there when Richard Whitmore built this company from nothing. I was there when his wife died. I was there when his daughter Eleanor grew from a baby into a beautiful young woman." She paused, letting the name sink in. "Eleanor?" Victoria Thornton's face had gone pale. "Richard had a daughter. I never knew." "That's because she was erased." Ruth's voice hardened. "Erased from the family history. Erased from the company records. Erased from existence. By the man sitting at the head of this table." Every eye in the room turned to Harold. "This is ridiculous," Robert Hayes scoffed. "Harold is Richard's nephew. He inherited everything legally. I've seen the will myself." "You've seen a forged will," Dr. Foster spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "I was Richard's attorney for over 40 years. I drafted his original will myself. The one that left everything to his daughter Eleanor and her descendants. The will that was presented after Richard's death was not the one I witnessed him sign. The silence that followed was absolute." Ruth opened the cardboard box and began removing documents, spreading them across the polished table. "These are copies of 47 letters that Eleanor wrote to her father after she left home. Every single one was intercepted by Harold before Richard could read them." She placed the stack of letters in the center of the table. "Eleanor spent years begging her father to forgive her, to let her come home. Richard died believing his daughter had abandoned him. He never knew she had tried to reach him dozens of times." Victoria Thornton reached for one of the letters with trembling hands. She began to read, and within seconds tears were streaming down her face. "This is dated 6 months after Eleanor left." Her voice broke. "She's telling Richard about her wedding, about how she wishes he could have been there, about how she still loves him and always will." Ruth pulled out more documents. "This is Eleanor's marriage certificate. She married James Morrison, a mechanic who worked for this company. This is the birth certificate of their daughter, named after Richard's mother. And this," she placed a worn photograph on the table, "is Eleanor holding her grandson Tommy for the first time, 3 weeks before she died." The photograph made its way around the table. Board members who had spent decades making cold, calculated business decisions found themselves wiping their eyes. Tommy stepped forward, his young face serious but composed. "My great-grandmother Eleanor died when I was 2 years old." His voice was clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "I don't remember her face. I only know her through photographs and stories. But I know she loved me, and I know she spent her whole life trying to come home to a father who never got her messages." He turned to look directly at Harold. "Because this man made sure he never did." Harold finally moved. He pushed back his chair and stood, his legs unsteady, his face ashen. "Everything they've said is true." The words fell like stones into still water. "I came to the Whitmore mansion when I was 15 years old. Richard took me in when I had nothing. He gave me everything, a home, an education, a future." Harold's voice cracked. "And I repaid him by destroying his family." He walked to the window, unable to face the people he had deceived for so long. "Eleanor was the kindest person I ever knew. She treated me like a brother when everyone else looked down on me. But I was jealous. Jealous of her inheritance, jealous of her position, jealous of the love Richard had for her." The confession poured out like poison being drained from a wound. "When she fell in love with James, I saw my opportunity. I turned Richard against her. I planted suspicions in his mind. I watched them fight, watched her leave, and I felt nothing but satisfaction." Victoria Thornton covered her mouth with her hand, tears flowing freely. And then the letters started coming. Eleanor begging for forgiveness, telling Richard about her life, her marriage, her child. And I intercepted every single one. I kept them hidden in a box like trophies. I let Richard die believing his daughter had abandoned him." Harold turned back to face the room, his eyes red. "The will you've all seen is a forgery. I created it after Eleanor left, when Richard was weakened by grief and confusion. The real will left everything to Eleanor. I stole this company. I stole this fortune. I stole a family's legacy." The boardroom had become a courtroom, and Harold had just delivered his own verdict. Dr. Foster rose slowly from his chair. "I suspected the truth when Harold presented that will nearly 3 decades ago. The language was different from Richard's usual style. The signatures seemed off, but I was afraid of losing my reputation, afraid of the powerful man Harold was becoming." The old lawyer's voice trembled with shame. "I stayed silent when I should have spoken, and that silence has haunted me ever since." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. "This is my sworn testimony, notarized and witnessed, confirming that the will currently on file is fraudulent. This is also a copy of Richard's original will, which I kept hidden in my personal safe for nearly 30 years, and this is my resignation from any legal privileges, effective immediately. I am prepared to face whatever consequences come." Victoria Thornton stood, her face a mixture of grief and fury. "Do you understand what you've done, Harold? Richard was my friend. I watched him wither away after Eleanor left. I held his hand at the hospital when he was dying. He kept asking if she had called, if she had written. He died saying her name." Her voice rose to nearly a shout. "And all along you knew. You knew she had tried to come back. You knew he could have seen his granddaughter. You knew, and you let him die in despair." Harold had no defense, no explanation, no excuse. Tommy walked around the table until he stood directly in front of Harold. The 10-year-old boy and the 57-year-old man faced each other in silence. "My great-grandmother forgave you before she died." Tommy spoke softly, but every person in the room heard him clearly. "She told my grandmother Ruth that hate was too heavy a burden to carry, that forgiveness was not about letting the other person off the hook. It was about setting yourself free." Harold felt tears he had suppressed for decades finally break through. "I don't deserve forgiveness." "Maybe not." Tommy's brown eyes held wisdom far beyond his years. "But that's not really your choice to make, is it?" The boy reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single envelope, yellowed with age. "My great-grandmother wrote this letter the day before she died. She asked Ruth to give it to me when I was ready, but I think you need to hear it more than anyone." Tommy opened the envelope and began to read. "To whoever holds this letter when I am gone, I have lived a life that most would call tragic. I lost my father's love. I lost my husband too soon. I watched my daughter struggle to raise a child alone. And now I am leaving this world before I am ready. But I want you to know something important. I am not bitter. I am not angry. I am grateful. Grateful for the years I had with James. Grateful for my beautiful daughter. Grateful for my precious grandson. Grateful for every moment of love that filled my life, even when that life was hard." Tommy's voice wavered but continued. "If you are reading this, Harold, know that I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred for nearly 3 decades has already cost my family too much. I will not let it cost my grandson his future. Be better than you were. It is never too late to choose a different path. With hope for your soul, Eleanor." The letter fell from Tommy's hands as silence consumed the room. Harold Whitmore, the man who had stolen an empire, sank to his knees on the boardroom floor and wept like a child. And somewhere, perhaps, Eleanor Whitmore finally found peace. The silence in the boardroom stretched for what felt like an eternity. Harold Whitmore remained on his knees, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his body. The man who had commanded rooms full of powerful executives, who had built a billion-dollar empire on stolen foundations, now knelt broken on the cold marble floor like a child seeking absolution. The board members sat frozen in their chairs, uncertain how to respond to the complete collapse of everything they had believed for nearly 3 decades. Victoria Thornton wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. Robert Hayes stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's gaze. David Chen had removed his glasses and was pressing his fingers against his closed eyelids. Dr. William Foster broke the silence first. "The legal implications of what has been revealed today are significant." His voice was steady despite his age. "The original will clearly establishes Eleanor Whitmore and her descendants as the rightful heirs to the entire Whitmore estate. That includes this company, all properties, and all financial assets." He turned to look at Tommy, who stood quietly beside Ruth, the old briefcase still clutched against his chest. Young man, by law, everything you see around you belongs to you. Every building, every contract, every dollar. You are the sole legitimate heir to one of the largest fortunes in the Midwest. The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Tommy looked at the faces around the table, at the executives in their expensive suits, at the paintings on the walls worth more than Ruth's trailer, at the view of Chicago stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Then he looked at Ruth, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "Can I say something?" Tommy's voice was quiet but clear. Victoria Thornton leaned forward. "Of course, child. This is your moment, your birthright." Tommy walked slowly around the table, his sneakers making soft sounds on the polished floor. He stopped in front of the large portrait of Richard Whitmore that dominated one wall of the boardroom. The painted eyes of his great-great-grandfather seemed to look down at him with an expression that could have been stern or could have been kind. "My mom used to tell me stories about this family." Tommy spoke without turning around. "About the mansion where my great-grandmother grew up. About the gardens where she used to play. About a grandfather who loved her so much that losing her broke his heart." He reached up and touched the frame of the portrait. "She also told me about the day everything changed. About how my great-grandmother had to choose between the man she loved and the father she adored. About how she walked away with nothing but hope and came back with nothing but letters that were never read." Tommy finally turned to face the room. "I used to dream about this moment. When I was little, sleeping on a mattress on the floor of Grandma Ruth's trailer, I used to imagine walking into this building and taking back everything that was stolen from my family. I used to imagine making the people who hurt us pay for what they did." His brown eyes moved to Harold, still kneeling on the floor. "But my great-grandmother taught me something. Through her letters, through her stories, through the way she lived her life, even when that life was hard. She taught me that revenge doesn't fill the empty spaces. It just creates new ones." Tommy reached into the briefcase and pulled out a worn photograph. He walked over to Harold and knelt down beside him, so they were face to face. "This is my great-grandmother holding me when I was a baby, 3 weeks before she died. Look at her face." Harold lifted his tear-stained eyes to the photograph. Eleanor's face, gaunt from illness but radiant with love, smiled back at him. In her arms, a tiny Tommy slept peacefully, unaware that his world was about to shatter. "She's not angry," Tommy said softly. "Even knowing she was dying, even knowing her father died without ever reading her letters, even knowing you stole everything from her, she's not angry, she's at peace." Harold's voice came out as a broken whisper. "How? How could she forgive me?" "Because she understood something that took me a long time to learn." Tommy stood up and looked around the room. "She understood that holding on to anger is like carrying a heavy stone everywhere you go. Eventually, it doesn't hurt the person who wronged you, it only hurts you." Ruth stepped forward, her weathered face filled with pride. "Eleanor told me something before she died. She said that true wealth has nothing to do with money, that the richest person she ever knew was James, her husband, who never had more than a few dollars in his pocket, but gave her more love than she could hold. She said the poorest person she ever knew was the man who stole her inheritance because he would spend his whole life guarding something that could never make him happy." Her eyes met Harold's. "She pitied you, Harold, even at the end. She pitied you because she knew that everything you took would never be enough, that you would always be hungry, that you would always be afraid, that you would never know what it felt like to be truly at peace." Harold lowered his head, fresh tears streaming down his face. Tommy walked back to the center of the room and faced the board members. "Doctor, Foster said that everything here belongs to me now, that I'm the legal heir to all of this." He gestured at the room around him. "But I don't want it." The reaction was immediate. Gasps. Murmurs. Victoria Thornton half rose from her chair. "Tommy, do you understand what you're saying? This fortune is worth billions. You could have everything, the best schools, the finest homes, a life without worry or want." "I know," Tommy nodded. "But my great-grandmother had none of those things and she was happy. My mom had none of those things and she loved me more than anything in the world. Grandma Ruth has none of those things, and she took me in when she had nothing left to give except her heart." He looked at Ruth with eyes full of love. "The people who raised me taught me that you don't measure wealth by what you have. You measure it by what you give, by how you treat people who can do nothing for you, by the love you leave behind when you're gone." Tommy turned back to the board. "I don't want to run a company. I'm 10 years old. I want to go to school. I want to play with friends. I want to take care of Grandma Ruth like she took care of me. I want to live the kind of simple, honest life that my great-grandmother dreamed of when she left this mansion with nothing but love in her heart." Victoria Thornton's voice was gentle. "Then, what do you want to do with the inheritance, Tommy? It has to go somewhere." Tommy was quiet for a moment, thinking, then he spoke. "I want to set up something that helps kids like me. Kids who lost their parents. Kids who don't have anywhere to go. Kids who are sleeping in shelters or on the streets wondering if anyone in the world cares about them." He looked at Harold. "And I want him to run it." The shock in the room was palpable. Robert Hayes actually laughed in disbelief. "You want the man who stole your family's fortune to manage your charitable trust? That's insane." "No." Tommy shook his head. "It's the only thing that makes sense." He walked over to Harold and extended his hand. "My great-grandmother forgave you. She wanted you to be better. She believed people could change. So I'm going to give you the chance to prove her right." Harold stared at the small hand extended toward him, the hand of the child whose family he had destroyed. The hand offering him something he had never expected and certainly did not deserve. Redemption. "Why?" Harold's voice cracked. "After everything I did, after all the pain I caused, why would you give me this chance?" Tommy's answer was simple. "Because Grandma Ruth taught me that everyone deserves a second chance. And because my great-grandmother loved you once, when you were just a scared boy with nothing. Maybe if someone had given you a second chance back then, things would have been different." Harold reached up with trembling hands and took Tommy's hand in both of his. "I will spend every day of whatever life I have left trying to be worthy of this." His voice shook with emotion. "I will help every child I can. I will tell Eleanor's story. I will make sure no one ever forgets what she sacrificed and what she forgave." Tommy nodded and helped Harold to his feet. Ruth approached them, her eyes glistening. "There's one more thing, Tommy. Something I've been saving." She reached into the cardboard box and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From inside, she withdrew a simple gold locket on a delicate chain. This was Eleanor's. She wore it every day of her life. Inside is a picture of her father, taken before everything fell apart. She wanted you to have it. Tommy opened the locket. On one side was a young Richard Whitmore, smiling warmly at the camera. On the other side was a tiny photograph of Eleanor as a child, laughing in a garden filled with flowers. "She told me to tell you something when I gave you this." Ruth's voice trembled. She said, "Tell Tommy that the real inheritance is not in bank accounts or buildings. The real inheritance is the love we carry in our hearts and the kindness we show to others. That is what lasts. That is what matters. That is what I leave to him." Tommy clutched the locket against his chest, tears finally spilling down his young face. Victoria Thornton stood slowly, her voice thick with emotion. "In all my years in business, I have never witnessed anything like this. A child who could have everything choosing instead to give. A victim offering forgiveness to the one who wronged him. This is not just remarkable. This is extraordinary." She looked around at her fellow board members. "I move that we honor Tommy's wishes in full. That we establish the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Children, funded by the Whitmore estate, with Harold Whitmore serving as its director under the supervision of a board that includes Ruth Macmillan and Tommy himself when he comes of age." One by one, the board members raised their hands in agreement. Dr. Foster smiled, the weight of nearly 3 decades of guilt finally lifting from his shoulders. "Richard would be proud," he said quietly. "Not of the fortune, not of the company, but of this, of the great-great-grandson who chose love over revenge. Eleanor's legacy lives on in you, Tommy. The best parts of this family live on in you." Tommy walked to the window and looked out at the city spread below. Somewhere out there, children were waking up hungry. Children were wondering if anyone cared. Children were losing hope, but now maybe some of them would find it again. Ruth came to stand beside him, placing her weathered hand on his shoulder. "Your mama would be so proud of you," she whispered. "Your great-grandmother, too. You did what they always dreamed of. You brought this family back together. You turned pain into purpose." Tommy leaned against her, the locket warm in his hand. "Grandma Ruth, do you think they can see us? Mom and great-grandma Eleanor?" Ruth smiled through her tears. "I think they've been watching over you every single day, sweetheart. And I think right now they're smiling." Outside the window, the grey clouds that had covered the city all morning began to part. A single ray of sunlight broke through, illuminating the boardroom in golden light. And in that moment, a 10-year-old boy who had arrived barefoot and dirty, carrying nothing but an old briefcase full of letters, became the richest person in the room. Not because of the billions he had inherited, but because of the love he had chosen to give. Eleanor Whitmore had spent her life trying to come home, and finally, through her great-grandson, she had.